I'm going to start by telling you kind of how stories work in general, breaking down the key principles of good storytelling, and then talk about how can you apply them in business. It's obviously going to be the kind of abbreviated version that we're going to have time to cover today, but I have to start at the beginning, right, and tell you guys, kind of talk about how stories work first. And in order to do that, I'd like to show you a video that is a story.
So it's a beautiful day. I'm about 5,000 feet above Albany in a little plane. And the girl who just pushed me out is screaming, wait, your chute! And then she's gone, like with the wind. And the rest of the sentence is gone. I don't hear it, and I don't think it ends, functioning properly. No problem. I think it ends, worse than that. I was in my 40s, but I didn't want to be one of these kind of midlife guys who runs out and buys a convertible. Besides, who needs two convertibles? But I needed something, something, more than like a hair weave, which actually became a consideration one day when I found this kind of round pink patch on the top of my head, the shape, size, and texture of a slice of bologna, covered in sort of thin, wispy brown, like mold up there. And I was 23 years old. And then I was 30, and then I was 40, and then I was in my 40s. So it was time to get younger. And I drove up to the Albany Skydiving Academy, upstate, to meet Annette, the school's khaki-shorted, bare-bellied, adorable 19-year-old senior instructor. She looked like a lowercase I with a smiley dot face in her head. I was like capital O. So I am watching the pilot out in the runway playing hacky sack, and Annette says, "This is going to be awesome," and then she tells me I have pretty eyes, and she hands me the liability waiver. And instead of kind of, being Darwinian and just going to a bowling alley right then, I sign it because she is just so excited for me. And we go outside, and she says we can start the 2-hour lesson with a landing because, and she kind of pokes me in the ribs, most times it's not the fall that gets you, it's the sudden stop, which is a joke to kind of put me at ease. It doesn't work. So she kicks over this kind of blue plastic milk crate, tells me to get up, and it's wobbly. I have to hold onto her shoulder, and tells me to jump. And I jump, and my feet kick up these two little puffs of dust. It's like Neil Armstrong. And she laughs, and she gives me the thumbs up. She says, like I have the right stuff. And then she shows me how to do a drop and roll, which is kind of what it sounds like as you drop to the ground and you roll into the dust, kind of like what you do when you're on fire. She does one like a Romanian gymnast and tells me to get up and do one. And she says, she helps me up. She says, just hop on the bus, Gus. And I think, her parents must listen to Paul Simon. I feel a connection. So I say, I am a rock, and I drop like a stone. And she laughs, and she helps me up, and she helps me pick the gravel out of my, pebbles out of the palms of my hand. And she says that's pretty much all there is to it, which would be true if she were teaching me how to jump off a milk crate and out of an airplane. So for the next hour and a half, we go from the milk crate to a wooden kitchen chair, to a wooden painter's ladder, to 5,000 feet above sea level. Where she kind of, tightens my helmet, looks at me through my foggy goggles, and, says, jump nice for me, and I'm nodding because she's just so adorable. And then she shows me the static line, which is this canvas strap that is supposed to automatically yank my chute open as soon as I jump. She tugs on it a couple of times to prove that it can kind of take the upper body strength of a teenage girl. And then, and she says, once we get into position, I'm gonna say go, and I'm gonna pat you on the back. When I do that, you just go. And she says, don't worry, I'll be gentle. Between the altitude and the pillow talk, I'm like in a trance. I will do anything. And then she helps me out onto the little platform under the wing, and I can feel her hand in my back. It feels like kind of a kitten's paw through the, through the jumpsuit. When I look down and I see all these kind of chimneys and pointy, pine trees down there, I begin to weaken. But when she says go and gives me a little shove, I go for her. And then she starts screaming, wait, your chute, it's... And the kind of pathetic inadequacy of a 2-hour lesson kind of dawns on me. And I'm looking down at the power lines down there, and I'm kind of reflexively squeezing my legs together so I don't land like two flounders on the ground and die that way. And I am hoping that my life doesn't flash before my eyes, because I don't want to ruin my last few seconds. Trying to be positive. If it occurred to me, I would have realized, well, at least I'm not going to be getting any older. Another bit positive. And then all of a sudden, this kind of loop of canvas static line flashes past my head, and it pulls taut, and it yanks my chute out, and I'm kind of spun around, and I'm hanging under this beautiful, big, fluffy, white canopy. It's really beautiful, and it is really quiet, so I can really hear my heart pounding. Now, when I land, she's already down there waiting for me, beaming. She has a little plastic champagne glass with the complimentary, sparkling wine they told her. And I kind of drag all my shit over the straps and the helmet, the chute, and I say, what the fuck? And she giggles, and she says, well, you look like you're a cool guy, and I wanted to make sure you had like an awesome And the little thing with the malfunctioning parachute was just to spike your adrenaline. I had learned it from a bungee jumping friend of mine. And I'm curious, do you have any idea how dangerous that was, how terrifying it was? And she says, hey, well, you did it, right? You're fine. You did it at least before it's too late. And before it's too late, that's worse than, pushing me out of a plane. So I'm staring at her trying to think of something to say, but as I'm staring, I kind of remember I just jumped out of a plane and I kind of fell a mile without dying, most of it without a parachute as far as I was concerned. I did it on purpose, and now I want to do it again. Because, the little joke she told, maybe it was right, it's not the fall that gets you, it's the sudden stop, so now I want to do it again. And I sign up for another jump. And I give her the finger, and we both laugh, and I drive off with the top down. But I'm not crazy, I never went back. But I eventually fell into something else, something equally as terrifying, just as kind of rejuvenating, doing this kind of thing. Thank you.
The first thing I'd like to remind you guys of is that there's a difference between what happened and the story about what happened, right? I think we all know that, but we tend to forget, and when we forget, we get stuck just giving an account of what happened. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and that is not a story. Stories have to be organized according to some higher or deeper principle than the mere chronology of what happened, okay? I like to call it the theme. And of course, the word theme can mean many things, and sometimes stories can have multiple themes, but what I'm talking about here is, at its core, at its very essence, what is the story about, right? So for instance, in Andy's story, you could say it's a skydiving story, and you would not be wrong, right? It's a story about jumping out of an airplane, but I would argue that at the deeper level, it's not really a skydiving story. What would you say? Anyone? What would you say the story is really about? Getting old. Thank you. Who said that? Getting old. Yeah. Does anybody disagree? To me, that's also very much what this story is about, right? Andy is clearly a guy in some kind of midlife crisis. But it's not like he knew that day when he drove up to Albany to jump out of a plane, right? It's not like he was sitting there in his convertible going, wow, look at me, I really must be in a midlife crisis. He was in it then, right? It was only later when he decided to tell the story that he had to sit down and ask himself, what was really going on there? Why did I do that? What was that about, right? So he starts mining for the theme. Because themes don't happen, themes are found. And it is our jobs as storytellers to find them. And so let me try to illustrate this a little bit further, the degree to which I would like you to think of the events of the facts of what happened, the events and the deeper story, the real story as separate. Let's say for a moment that instead of realizing, when he sat down to look for the theme, instead of realizing that he was a man in a midlife crisis who was dealing with aging, let's say he discovered something else. Let's say that he realized that what he was really wrestling with that day when he drove up to Albany to jump out of a plane was his lifelong struggle to feel accepted by his father, right, for instance. Let's say his father was a famous paratrooper, maybe a decorated war hero, right, who had always thought that his youngest son, Andy, was a bit of a wuss who could never live up to his father's expectations, right? So that's what he's up against that day when he's driving up to jump out of a plane for the first time. Very different story. Right? I think that would have been a very different story in the tone, the feel, the components, everything. But the actual facts of what happened on that day would not have changed one bit, right? Same day, same weather, same drive, same instructor, same plane, same jump. But very different story probably at the end of the day, the father-son story from the midlife crisis story. And on the flip side, I would argue that Andy could have told the midlife crisis story about a different set of events. He could have told that story perhaps about the day he bought his convertible. And met, the khaki-shorted, bare-bellied 19-year-old senior skydiving instructor, instead of being a skydiving instructor, might have been the young woman at the dealership who sold him the car, okay? So different day, completely different event, but in essence, the same story. He could have told the same story around a different set of events. And I say this to really hammer home the degree to which I would like you to think of these as operating on different levels. And the real story is where the theme is, right? And the events of what happened almost just become your excuse to tell that story. They sort of become the tent poles that you hang your canvas on, okay? Because too often we get stuck, we think that what happened is the story. The facts of what happened, the event is the story. The event is not the story. This is the story. And the events become your excuse to tell that story. Themes don't happen, they're found, and it is your job to find them, to find the real story in there. The next thing I would like you to think about anytime you're telling stories is what is at stake. And I mean that quite literally. What is there to be lost or won, right? There has to be something at stake. It could be something concrete, like all your money or your house. Those would be pretty big stakes. But it could also be something more ephemeral, like your dignity, your father's love, your wife's affection, your self-respect, your life. But there has to be something at stake, and it has to be clear to you, and it has to be clear to the audience. The theme can be more or less explicit. It's your organizing principle. You must know what it is. You don't always have to state it explicitly in the story. The stakes, however, have to be explicitly stated and clear, not just for you, but also for the audience. And we often make the mistake of thinking that the stakes reside in the plot. Gosh, if only something really exciting or dramatic ever happened to me, then I would have some stories to tell, right? But I'm here to tell you that I think the biggest bomb I ever put on the moth stage was the story that on paper was one of the most dramatic. It was a guy who was on a submarine that sank to the bottom of the ocean in 1939, and to my knowledge, nobody's ever been rescued from a greater level of depth. Most of the guys died instantly. A few of them survived in a little chamber. They were able to get a diving bell down there. The guys got into the diving bell. As he was being pulled up, something happened with the cable. They tumbled to the ocean floor. I mean, unbelievably dramatic story. And yet, the audience was asleep. Everybody was asleep because the guy who was telling the story was this typical kind of greatest generation, and he gave this very technical account, right? He did not tell a story. He was like, we were cheated to the FX30. And when I was working with him on the story ahead of time, I said, well, what were you feeling? What were you thinking? And he was like, oh, geez, the journalists have been asking me that for 50 years. I mean, I really don't know, right? And so as a result of that, everybody was asleep. And meanwhile, I've seen a guy tell a story at an open mic night about stealing a cookie when he was 7 years old, right? And he had everybody at the edge of their seats, just dying to find out whether he was going to get caught, right? And I mean, of course, the real life stakes between being trapped in a submarine at the bottom of the ocean and stealing a cookie from your own mother, no comparison, right? And yet, it was the second guy who had us at the edge of our seats. dying to find out what happened because he did a really good job at framing this up, at bringing us inside into what was at stake for him, which objectively speaking was not that high, but for him at 7 years old might very well have felt like being on the Titanic. Like if he was going to get caught, it might have felt as terrible as being on the submarine at the bottom of the ocean. And so it's actually one of the reasons I wanted to show you Andy's story, because he does a very good job of this. Skydiving is one of these things where it's as boring to hear about as I think it might be exciting to do. I've never done it, but I've had friends who've done it, and they've come home and they've said, oh my God, I just jumped out of a plane, and it sure looks exciting. And if you like that person, or if you love them, you're going to be happy for them, right? It's going to be infectious. You're like, oh, how wonderful that you had such a great experience. But if you're trying to move a room full of strangers with a story where you go, man, I jumped out of a plane and it was awesome, it's not going to move them very, very much, right? Because there is no suspense in a skydive the moment it's over, right? And Andy knows this. He's smart about this. Despite this little thing he does at the beginning with like, wait, your chute, and the whole kind of malfunctioning parachute, he does that for humor, not for suspense. We know he survived that jump. He's standing in front of us, right? There's zero suspense there, and he knows that. So instead, he finds a different set of stakes that are related to the real story, the underlying story, right? The midlife crisis story, the aging story, about how he found this patch of baloney at the top of his head when he was 23 years old, right? And then he says, I was 23 years old, I found this patch of baloney up here, and then I was 30, and then I was 40. It was time to get younger, right? So he introduces this other set of stakes, and stop me if you disagree, but to my mind, that's what makes us care. That's what gets us invested, involved. That's what makes us sweat with him. Not whether he survived jumping out of the plane, but he's on this mission to get younger, and we're a little bit concerned how that's going to work out for him, right? And then he meets that young woman, and it's like we don't want him to make a fool of himself, but we also don't want him to impress her, because that would be even more icky on another level. And so it's like, how is this going to work out for him? And that's what keeps us engaged, right? So the stakes is the opportunity to make the audience care. No one in real life would make an investment without knowing what is at stake, right? You would never invest without knowing what the potential gains or potential losses were. Similarly for your audience in a story, you have to invite them inside, give them an opportunity to understand what is at stake so that they may care about what happens to you in the story if you're the main storyteller. So, Andy does another thing also when he sets up the stakes. He doesn't just say, I was in a midlife crisis. He doesn't just make a general statement and ask you to take his word for it. He shows you. He talks about the baloney, the balding, the things that are going on, and he makes it real for you in that way, right? He shows you rather than tells you what is going on. I know this can be a little confusing because we're talking about storytelling, and I'm saying please tell stories, but now I'm saying don't tell, show, right? But what I'm asking you to do is to find a way to make it real for the audience and not ask them to take your word for it. I'll give you another example. I was working with a woman one time whose name was Barbara. She was telling a story about her grandmother, and she said, my grandmother was mean. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, let me give you an example. My grandmother owned a flower shop. She hated having us in there. Barbara and her little brother hated having the kids in there. They would break things, right? And one year, the grandmother saved every single thing that Barbara's little brother had broken in her flower shop that year. And come Christmas, she put those things in a box, she put a bow on it, and on Christmas morning, that was his present. And I was like, all right, Barbara, your grandmother was mean, right? But until she told me that, I had absolutely no way of evaluating that statement, my grandmother was mean, right? It could just be that Barbara's standards for mean are different from my standards for mean. It could be that was just Barbara's side of the story. Maybe she was the one who was really a little bit mean, right? I have no way of evaluating this statement until she gives me this example. She shows me, she makes it real for me, she makes me feel it. Similarly, if you're telling a classic horror story about being out in the woods and being chased by a monster and it's pitch black, if you say, oh, I was out in the woods and I was scared, you're asking them to take your word for it. If you can find a way to bring them into the woods with you, right, and it's pitch black, and you can hear the breathing and it's coming closer. I don't have time to really do it now, but you get the idea, right? If you can take them into the woods with you and make them scared with you, you're going to make them, it's going to be that much more engaging, persuasive, exciting for them, right? But that takes a lot longer. It takes a lot longer to say, to tell the Christmas story or to take them into the woods than to simply say, my grandmother was mean, or, I was scared, right? And so in order to buy yourself time to let those moments really come to life and unfold almost in real time, you have to make some choices, right? We have to make some critical choices, also known as editing. We all know we have to do it. We all know I don't know about you, but every single thing I've ever put out in the world, I felt like if I had more time, I would have made it shorter, as the French philosopher Pascal said. I think Mark Twain later paraphrased it. But we all know this. The problem is that most of the time, we don't know how to edit. I see it all the time when I work with people, when I work with executives on their presentations or pitches, or, that they are just like, oh, it's too long, I should cut. And then they just indiscriminately start cutting, like, let's chop a little bit here and a little bit there. And there's no kind of purpose to it because they don't know how to cut and what to cut. And this is where the theme becomes so important. Remember the theme we talked about at the top? You cannot edit unless you know what your theme is. Because what actually makes it into the story, even though I was saying, well, the effects of what happened that day would be the exact same, whether Andy was telling the midlife crisis story or he was telling the father-son story. True. But what actually makes it into the story could be very different and should be very different. For instance, I think if he were telling the father-son story, Annette, who's a pretty big character in this story, right? She's the skydiving instructor, the 19-year-old senior skydiving instructor. She probably wouldn't make it into the father-son story at all, right? And she's a big part of this story, but there might not be room for her in that story. She was still there that day. She still taught him how to jump out of a plane, but she might not make it into the ultimate story. And so you cannot edit without knowing. What you have to ask yourselves is, like, what is the story I'm telling here today, right? Because, and quite often in life, much more often than we think, we're in a situation where we have a father who was a paratrooper, and we're in a midlife crisis, and maybe there are 2 or 3 other things going on that might seem relevant. And we're like, well, I should put all of that in because what, I'm going to tell a skydiving story and not mention that my father was a paratrooper? No, if you're telling the midlife crisis story, actually probably not, right? But we forget that. We put in everything that seems relevant or seems interesting. And so we forget that most incidents in life, and especially most business projects, and we'll get to this in a second, I'll tell you I promise I'll connect it back to how it all fits into a business context. But most situations yield many stories, and we often just tell the same story over and over again instead of figuring out which is the story I'm telling today. Which, put another way, who's familiar with the term the arc of the story? The arc of the story is the journey you travel from beginning to end, right? It's the entirety of the journey of the story. And it travels from some kind of problem to some kind of resolution, right? It starts with a problem. In the classic romantic comedy, it's, the dorky guy's in love with the popular girl, and if he doesn't win her heart, he's gonna die, right? There's his problem. And by the end of the film, he wins the girl, right? So there's your resolution. Sometimes it's not such a direct equal sign. He wants the girl, he gets the girl, right? Sometimes it could be dorky guy's in love with the popular girl. In the course of the story, he discovers that she's actually not that nice a person and that he should have been in love with the dorky girl instead. And so in the end, he ends up living happily ever after with the dorky girl. It's not a direct equal. He wanted this is the girl he wanted, this is the girl he got, but it's still a solution to the initial problem he had, right? He's still overcome that problem and landed somewhere else where he can live happily ever after. Now, but the other thing that's significant here is that, the initial problem, I'm in love with the girl, and similarly, I just want to point out Andy's story, right? There's not such a direct equal sign, actually, if you look at his story. His story, he starts out wanting to get younger, right? And not surprisingly, he does not succeed in getting much younger, but he does get a little bit smarter, right? By the end of it, he says, I'm not crazy, I never went back, right? He says, instead I fell into something equally terrifying and exciting, doing this kind of thing, meaning telling stories, something that requires a higher level of reflection, a higher level of self-insight. And so he's not gotten younger, but he's gotten smarter. And instead of being the hamster sort of trapped in the wheel, forever chasing the impossible, he's found some way to move to a different place. Some kind of transformation has to take place between here and here. And this is what drives the story forward. But, so you're not the it's not a circle, right? But it's also not a flat line, and this is important. This shape represents a kind of building of the suspense of the story, right? So it starts with the stakes. Romantic comedy example, right? Again, I am the dorky guy, I'm in love with the popular girl, if she won't look my way, I will die. There are your stakes, big stakes, he's gonna die, right? May not be objectively true, this is how he feels, and the story kind of is off. But then it often gets worse, right, before it gets better. It's not like he gets to the solution right away or the story would be over. No, first we find that every time he has a chance to actually interact with this girl and maybe make an impression on her, he makes a complete fool of himself, and it gets worse. The odds that he'll ever end up with her get less, right? Then we find out that she's actually already got a boyfriend, right? All right, so it gets even worse, and maybe he's the popular quarterback, right? So he doesn't have a chance, and so on. And so you build the tension of the story, right? And this is important because this is the polar opposite of how almost everybody does business presentations. How many of you are familiar with the tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you've told them, right? When I go out into companies, that is 90% of how people present. And it's not terrible, right? If it works for you, I'm not saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? It looks more like this, right? Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you've told them. If that can be times when that works. But from a storytelling point of view, it's a little bit like saying, this is a murder mystery about how the butler did it, right? You're killing all suspense before you even start. And that can be a problem at times, especially if what you're presenting is really new or really innovative or controversial in some way, right? Because or if it looks like something you did 2 years ago, that everybody already has an idea like why this is not going to work, right? Anytime you're up against that, which often we are in business, if you run in and say, here's, the butler did it, you end up, before you even have a chance to tell, like, you're here, and they've already made up their minds, and you don't even get to tell your story, right? And so what I would like to advocate is not that you use storytelling in business, meaning get up there and tell a story about your grandmother or, God forbid, your midlife crisis, right? It's not what I'm here to do. Often when I'm brought in, people say, oh, Leah's here to tell us how to use little anecdotes to be kind of personable and break the ice and make it a little fun. And sure, that's great. Like if you have the perfect anecdote that perfectly suits the thing you're presenting in a seamless way and really helps bring the point home, great, use it. I would say that's the case less than 10% of the time, and honestly, probably less than that, right? So instead, what people do is they tag on these little anecdotes. Did I tell you about the time I went fishing with my friend? And it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel like it actually supports the point. It feels like too designed to do exactly what you're trying to do, which is like be real and be fun and be nice and be personable. A much more powerful way to use storytelling all those other times when you don't have the perfect anecdote from your own life is to structure your presentations differently and to use these principles, which in fact, these exact same principles that I've presented now can be used in any form of business presentation. But of course, the way you apply them is a little bit different. If we're talking about the theme, it does not. Right? In business, there's a different dynamic. You're not just telling a story, you are always also selling a story. And it creates a different dynamic between you and the audience off the bat. And it gives them more power, right? Because they are the ones that you ultimately need buy-in from. And so it does not start with you, right? When I said in storytelling, it's our job to find that theme, and we saw how that was a pretty introspective process. Wow, what was going on for me? How did I really feel? In business storytelling, it starts with them. It's not what's going on for you, it's what's going on for them, right? Who's your audience, and what do you know about them, right? And what do they need to hear? Not what do you have to talk about, why is it important, why do you like it, why does it matter to you? Who are they, and what do you know about them, right? On the other hand, you can't just tell them what they want to hear. I mean, that would be nice, right? But something we can't, if we've invented a time machine, we can't pretend it's a lawnmower, right? So you, of course, also have to know your subject, and the subject is not you, right? The subject is whatever you're talking about that day. And where those two overlap is where your theme is. So, similarly with the stakes, it's not doesn't start with what is at stake for you, it starts with what is at stake for them, right? It's not what keeps you up at night, it's what keeps them up at night. But so often we're very results oriented, and we've spent 3 months or 3 years working on a solution for something, and we run in and we're like, here it is. And we forget that they have been on none of this journey with us, all the stops you made along the way, all the reasons. And so you run in and say, and even if it's an internal audience, the very people perhaps who gave you the brief, I mean, even when they do very well know what it is that you were tasked with solving, it is very important to remind, it can be very effective, I should put it that way, to remind them, what is it that I'm here to solve? I know. This is an opportunity for you to start by saying, I know what keeps you up at night. And that, by the way, is also what I am here to solve. The reason why it is like this or looks like this, whatever solution or design you've come up with, is not because I love this particular color blue and I fell in love with it in Morocco 10 years ago when I was visiting. No, it's because you've considered what keeps them up at night. And so it doesn't, but the principle is the same, of instead of starting here, you start with the problem, but the problem is their problem, not your problem. And showing them what you mean becomes all the more important, right? Because you're in this different dynamic where you're not just telling them a story, you're selling them a story. And so making it real for them, finding a way to use the examples, not standing up there and saying, I see it all the time. People get up there and they have tons and tons of information, they have tons and tons of stats, but they haven't digested it, they haven't looked for that. You know, when I worked with Barbara on that story about her grandmother, and she said my grandmother was mean, and she told me the Christmas story, she had 5 other examples. She said, well, I could also tell you about the time she did this, and we could also talk about the time she did this. And I said, we don't need those, right? The Christmas story was enough, I get it, right? We can move on now. But so often I see people instead using this model, and it actually isn't just this model, right? It's slide after slide after slide after slide with tons and tons of information, right? And so, yes, you want to show, but maybe you don't need 40 examples or 10 or even 3 if you found the one that gets the job done, right? So you edit, you become selective about the information, and you take them on a journey that travels from the problem that you know they have that keeps them up at night to what is, of course, your solution, but is a solution that feels to them like the answer to their problem. Does anybody have any questions? I know this is like a crazy short amount of time to try to cover something that's rather complex and is normally a longer interactive workshop, but this is what I was asked to do, so I wanted to try to give you kind of the highlights of it. Yeah.
This is super valuable for like an individual presentation. I'm wondering if you thought about it at all, like applying storytelling techniques in the context of a broader brand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe if you think brands are doing well, what is that?
Well, it's a completely different process in a way. I mean, I think the principles very much are the same, but and you can apply those. But I find that the biggest thing often is with brand is agreeing. For getting people internally to agree on what the brand is and figuring out how to tell the story. You can actually take these principles and kind of apply them, but it's a little bit hard to address because it operates on a different level, and I decided to keep it very concrete where you could kind of take the steps and apply them to something very specific. And how you apply them to a bigger brand story is kind of, it's a little bit of a bigger story than, you know, maybe I have time to go into today. But yeah, do you have a sub-question to that or no? Or a more specific?
I guess the sub-question would be like, are there specific examples of brands that you thought have done that?
Well, Yeah, I mean, it's the question of how you present a brand in different, see, the thing is, it's always about audience and context, right? And so it's very hard even to say, like, the story of a particular brand or a particular product or in a particular presentation is going to change every single time you talk about it. That, I think, is the biggest mistake that people don't realize with the presentations. The brand at its core should be, if you have a strong story, if the most amazing thing happened to you, sometimes you don't need to do all of this, right? Granted, you can ruin it, like the example of the guy with the submarine story, right? You can absolutely ruin a very dramatic story. But if some unbelievable thing happened to you, usually you don't have to go through all of these principles in order to get out, in order to make the story exciting, because it is inherently exciting. What I'm trying to teach is how do you take boring stories and make them exciting? Things that are inherently boring, and how can you make them more exciting? And so the thing with brands is, ideally, they should be authentic enough that they don't need that. That doesn't mean they don't need good storytelling, but how to do that is a little bit of a different level. But yeah, I'm trying to figure out a short way to say it. But in a certain way, the ideal brand is its own story and does not need all of this. What I'm trying to teach is how can you take something boring and make it, that doesn't mean that brands don't need storytelling. They need storytelling, but on a different level, and I don't think I have time to go into it. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is around when you're doing an interview.
Yeah.
So like they ask you like, tell me about yourself.
Yeah.
So would you rather like start, like from the problem all the way to like building it up until you got here, or start here and work your way back?
When you are asking someone else?
Or when you were asked, for example.
When you are asked.
When you're asked.
Oh, in an interview.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Knowing the story and telling the story are not necessarily the exact same thing, right? Or in a certain way, this whole process happens twice. The first time you go through the process, you're trying to figure out what the story is. The next time, you're trying to figure out how to tell it. And so the fact that you know the whole story from point A to point B, I'll address it maybe in a slightly more general. In an interview or in an elevator or in an informal situation, maybe on the phone or at a cocktail party, it might be a little bit awkward if you launch into a whole 20, 30, 40-minute story, right, about, well, let me start at the beginning and please don't interrupt me because I'm on a path here and I got to get to the resolution or else it's not going to be interesting. But knowing in yourself what this framework is will allow you to improvise much better in the 15-second space or the 30-second or the interview situation or the elevator or right? Because you know what the story is. That doesn't mean you have to deliver the whole story, right? Every single time. But you can much more quickly kind of dip into and pull out the aspect of the story that you need the most, that's most relevant or going to be most effective in that situation, if you have done the work of figuring out of all this massive information, what is the story in there, right? And so, does that address it? Yeah. So no, I wouldn't do that, but I still think it's worth it. Even sometimes when you don't know, you're going into a situation, you don't know how much time you're going to have. You don't know. Often people think, well, one question I often get is, how do I deal with questions? And what if people want to interrupt, right? Because nobody has the attention span to go through a whole story. And, what if but here's the thing, it doesn't necessarily have to be very long, the story, right? And there can also be all kinds of additional information that can be delivered to them. Afterwards, you can hand out additional information. I one time was working at a big apparel sports company, and I was working with a creative director, and he had a presentation about something that was going to be very controversial from a brand point of view, right? And he knew he was going to go in, and everybody was going to say, that's not who we are, and that's not who we've been, and he knew he was up against something massive in that sense. And he had this big presentation about all the wonderful attributes of his idea, right? And he ended up scrapping that, and he came in with a foam board of the Titanic. And that was his only visual. He scrapped all his slides. He had this kind of covered, and he revealed it, and that's what they walked into. And he said, this is us. He was tasked with solving, they were losing market share at such a rapid clip in a particular area, and this is what he was, and he said, this is us, right? And then he did a 3-minute presentation that was basically just about, here's where we are, right? And instead of running in and saying, here's everything that I have figured out and all the wonderful things that I've, and so what it did, right, was it set up the stakes, and it brought them onto his side almost immediately, and it was a 3-minute presentation, right? And he just said, this is us, right? And it was a way to grab the attention, show them, I get the urgency of this. I'm not just on the creative side. I'm not just a creative director who thinks that, oh, this is a wonderful idea because I had it. No, I know what you people on the business side, what keeps you up at night. And so it was the entire thing he scrapped from a 45-minute presentation to a 3-minute presentation. And instead of getting all this, oh, this is not who we are, and this is blah, 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 he kind of caught them off guard by showing them, oh, like this is what we're dealing with, right? I and you are all in the same boat. We're all going down together on this Titanic unless we find a way to solve this problem. And so if it doesn't necessarily have to be longer, right? Then there could be all kinds, then after that 3-minute presentation, they were like, oh, could we see more about your idea? And could you, and he had that whole deck and he handed it to them and he was like, well, here's all the stats and the research and the ideas and the solution. But the first thing he did was kind of get them on board. And so you don't always have to tell the whole story, but what you've thought about is, what do I need to get across in this moment? What is the essence? In one word or one sentence, where do we travel from and to, right? What is this story at its core? What is it about? And if you've done that work of synthesizing that for yourself, it doesn't mean you actually have to deliver every single aspect of it. But are there any final questions? No? Okay. Thank you.